Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York. Thank you. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò. My name is Stefano Albertini, and I'm the director. And I'm delighted that we have this chance to present the new translation of Menzogne's Sortilegio, Lies and Sorcery, by Jenny McPhee here at the Casa. For me, it's a great occasion to do two things. First and foremost, to celebrate the great Elsa Morante, definitely one of the greatest, I'm tempted to say the greatest writer of Italy in the 20th century. And very often, for many different reasons that would be worth to explore, not aptly recognized for her contribution to literature and to Italian culture and Italian society more broadly. So it's great to bring Elsa under the spotlight and give her a full evening after the presentation of the documentary that we had here about a week ago. And the other is a celebration of translation and of translators. As we know, most of their work is done in their own homes without anybody around, obviously. But they play a fundamental role in anything that has to do with cultural dialogue between different civilizations, different nations. It's really much more than translating, it's interpreting, is understanding, and it's contributing to make other people understand. So this evening is also a celebration of translators. Some of them are here in the front row, some of them in the audience, and we are all very, very grateful to them for what they do. The New York Times called this translation inspired, but sometimes the translator is not even mentioned in reviews and articles in newspapers. That must change. Translators, again, play a fundamental role. Their own writing becomes the protagonist. Umberto Eco would say, half jokingly, but not that jokingly, that more people read William Weaver, his American translator, than Umberto Eco. And here we have Anne Goldstein. She could say, she doesn't say, she's too modest, but she could say the same thing about Elena Ferrante. More people read Elena Ferrante's language than, Anne Goldstein language than Elena Ferrante language. As you know, Elena Ferrante is translated and published in the United States and very popular. And that has a lot to do, definitely also, with Anne's translation. We have a lot to do tonight. I just want to emphasize that this semester was entirely or almost entirely dedicated to Italian literature of the 20th century. From Malaparte and Franco Baldasso, that I'm going to introduce in a minute, was instrumental in having a big conference here, to Pier Vittorio Tondelli, Calvino, Pavese, you name it. And there is more coming. Calvino, especially, we're going to have a celebration of his 100th anniversary, and in that evening we're going to have Giunpa Lairi, who is right there, and her take on Calvino. She did a great presentation on Pavese, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Giunpa will have to say on Calvino. Calvino's own daughter, Giovanna, will present the letters of her father to her mother, never published before, and we're going to have a brand new documentary on Calvino, so do not miss that and all the other literary events that are upcoming. Last thing, remember there are copies of the book upstairs for sale, and Jenny will be happy to sign them for you. And literature lives if people buy books. So remember that. And yes, to be a host of this evening and to chair the panel, we have invited Franco Baldasso. He's our creation. He got his PhD here from New York University. It's always a pleasure when one of our former students come back and presents and promotes, and it shows that the enthusiasm and the passion that they had when they were here continues wherever they are. Franco is now a professor of Italian literature at Bard College, and really also a very active public figure, not only in the classroom, but outside, bringing Italian literature outside of the classroom to larger audiences. He, as I mentioned, was responsible for the great conference on Malaparte and the visual arts that we had here 2 weeks ago. And tonight he's here to be the host and to introduce his guests. I just mentioned their names, but you'll do the real thing. So please welcome Franco Baldasso.
I'm really excited to be here tonight to introduce, before before introducing Jenny McPhee and Anne Goldstein to introduce this book, Lies and Sorcery, Menzogne Sortilegio by Elsa Morante, which is one of the great books of the 20th century. We cannot walk around this definition. It's really how we get started, because this translation is inspired. It's also necessary. It was a book that was translated early on in the United States, and the book is, pretty thick, about 800 pages. Well, the previous translation cut 200 pages, so it was another book, a butcher translation, a butcher book, honestly, and we are here tonight to celebrate the fact that even in English, finally we can read one of the great accomplishments of Italian literature of the last century. This looks grandiose, but actually this book was really instrumental to change the perception of what literature can do in the years after Second World War. I'm just saying something about this book because starting from what is for me the most apparent feature, the fact that it's a book full of ghosts. It's a book that where characters live among ghosts. They desire the past, they desire a different future, but always with a looking back to the previous privilege, to the previous situation that they had. And this is difficult to understand if you don't contextualize this book when it came out, 1948, a situation in which Italy was looking to the future with a with sort of relief after the war, after the end of fascism. And this book has been singled out when it came out as something weird, something that is too much related to the kind of literature that we don't want to hear about because it was just past. Instead, this book, one by one, pointed the finger to the problems of the country, but also how we can have an intellectual discourse that can really encompass and show the political wrong of what's going on right now. So there's much to say about this. This is just an introduction to this difficult book. It's not an easy book. It's a very complex book. And Elsa Morante then became very famous in Italy, especially for history, la storia, Arturo's Island, l'Isola di Arturo. But this is a beginning that displaced and dislocated the trajectories, the geography of Italian literature in the early post-war. So I'm just going to start from the story of the manuscript of this voluminous book, and which deserves to be recounted here because as many great books from the late 40s, the manuscript was kind of lost. Elsa Morante, with her husband Alberto Moravia, who back at the time was much more famous than her, had to leave Rome in 1948 because of the Nazi takeover, and had to leave overnight. It was a tremendous story that's been recounted by a good friend of Morante and Moravia, Giacomo De Benedetti, that famously wrote about the Nazi takeover of the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Rome. But he had to leave, and she left the manuscript to a friend, Bragaglia. And basically they had to hide in Fondi, which is a small town, the center of Italy, like many other. We mentioned before Natalia Ginzburg with Leone Ginzburg, who was also hiding in Abruzzo, in parts of Italy that were not easy to reach. But she had to go back. She had to go back because her manuscript was there. And as soon as possible, in hiding, she was able to go back to Rome in 1944, in a Rome that was still shattered by what was going on. And the title of the book back then was very different, but it says something about its content. The story was this title that is like Story of My Grandmother, which is different from Lies and Sorcery. You can see there has been some evolution in the meantime, but maybe some evolution in how to craft something that was really in the heart of Elsa Morante, because she's been thinking about this book for years. So she was able to get back, retrieve the manuscript, and then together with Moravia, who was also working on another book, that a groundbreaking book of the time, which is La Romana, a woman from Rome. They were living in this very small apartment in Rome, and in two different rooms they were writing these two voluminous novels, which were very successful when they came out. No, the novel couldn't be more different, and I'm not going to talk about Moravia, I'm going to talk about this novel. And when it came out eventually in 1948, it won, as you saw, the prestigious Viareggio Prize, and published by Einaudi, which was back then the avant-garde, the leftist publishing house that was publishing books that were not commercial at all, run by great people like Pavese or Natalia Ginzburg, who really set the tone for what should be the culture of post-war Italy. This book has in its shortcomings, it also maintains this atmosphere of daring that was typical of Rome between 44-45, where intellectuals from all over Italy were flocking there because they had to rebuild the country. And the rage there, the moment of innovation was, of course, neorealism. So when the book came out, all the critics lamented, but this is not neorealism, it's something completely different. And probably, as Morante said, of course, I've been working years to do something that was just my own thing. In fact, the book is almost Baroque. The book is very far away from what you have in mind, like a chronicle, like the war, and so on and so forth, like Anna Magnani sacrificing herself for her child. This is the image that also, Italy was portraying all over the world. And I have a feeling that even the translation was butchered because there is no Anna Magnani in this book. There are women that are fiercely different, and they hurt themselves, they hurt the other, and it's very remarkable because it was pointing the finger of patriarchy in ways that they were really unforeseen, not just in Italy, but in Europe, and even after that. That's why I guess Elena Ferrante loved this book. She said this book has been, this Menzogne, sortilegio, Lies and Sorcery, has been my inspiration, because you can't find a character that you really like. There are some, okay, here and there. But you read there are so many characters that are so incredibly selfish, linked to privilege, linked to egotism, some of them linked to their own desires. All over the book, it's a book of desires, unfulfilled desires and privilege. Because what structured the book really, and I'm not going to go to the drama, to the plot, because can you imagine in 800 pages how many characters there are. They're fantastic, but it's good to read it on your own. But what I'm saying is that what is fantastic is exactly this criticism of Italian society without being outspoken, without talking about the people like Mussolini, the fascist prominent who really destroyed the country. Instead, Morante decides to step back and talk about the early 20th century, the moment when the Benedetto Croce, an influential philosopher, intellectual of the time, named that that's the real Italy before Mussolini. Well, that society, according to this book, is portrayed in a way that is you can see the seeds of what's going to happen after. All the characters really structure their desire on privilege. They want to achieve privilege. It's a society that has become secular, but what they want to really do is not being part of mass society. And you can see that because it's like the city that you can understand is Palermo, and there are parts that look like Rome, and you can see poverty, you can see nobility, and the characters are unable to give up, even the ones that are revolutionary, and that for the critics, the progressive critics of that time, they really hated the fact that even the revolutionary, especially the male, are trying to achieve something collective for their own personal goals, and they're unable to stick to collective ideals, but also they want to move on in order to raise to another level, using examples, models that are lies, are Menzogne, sortilegio, are lies and sorcery. And the book starts with a very interesting remark. I'm just going to, a poem. a poem. There are so many poems in this book, and they're very, very funny. They are kind of joyous. But the poem says, like in the beautiful translation by Jenny, says, in you fiction I cloak myself, lunatic garment. What does this mean? I'm still not sure. But this looks like some Baroque prose from the 17th century. And in the meantime, when she was interviewed, Morante was talking about, yes, because I was a young woman and I was ambitious. I wanted to write the novel that would end the story, the history rather, of novels. This is the last novel. Probably she didn't achieve that, but she made a great book regardless. And this book is really a way to get rid of romance. But not just romance like a love story, but romance in a way that we're structuring a kind of mentality and a bourgeois mentality that then led to fascism. Which is, very interesting as a take, because if you see the characters, there's really no, even the characters that you might like, at a certain point they stick to a presentation of their own society as something that is linked to patriarchy and to people who are just, like one of the main character, the male characters, who try very hard to set the tone of something that doesn't have to change. Society doesn't have to change. And what is more kind of unnerving, but also fascinating, is that the women of this book, Anna, Elisa, and so on and so forth, are collaborating to this, are collaborating to the fact that they are building their own prisons. The book ends with some delirious letters written by the main character, Anna, fascinating character, disturbing character, who's described as the center of the book, because the entire book is written by her daughter, who has never been loved by her, because Anna wanted to have a male child, which is like the big, one of the many, but I would say the big excruciating fact. Like a daughter that she's not been loved because she's not blonde and beautiful like the male child that her mom wanted to have. And she's instead curly hair, brunette, typically Sicilian, something completely different. So we're not talking about great drama, but the characters depict themselves as they were heroes and heroines of huge tragedies. And the distance between this tragedy depicted and the reality, the petty reality they're living, is exactly in the title. Much better than Story of My Grandmother, despite there is also a lot of grandmothers that are fun. Lies and Sorcery. So I just would like to conclude, to read something that, just two little passages, one from Natalia Ginzburg, who received the book, and I think it's important that she received the book, because in the Casa Editrice Einaudi, probably no, I don't think the other editors and readers would appreciate how forward-looking this book was, because it was definitely far away from everything that was literature in Italy in that moment. And she said something very interesting. I read Lies and Sorcery in one go, and I love it immensely. However, I can't say that I clearly understood at the time its importance and greatness. For me, it was an extraordinary adventure to discover, among those chapter titles that seemed 19th century to me, our own age and cities, with the same piercing and painful intensity as our own daily existence were described. So it's a testimony of something that was everyday life, was not the great heroes of the resistance, but still witnessed what was still lacking in Italian society, liberation for women, for instance, but a real liberation besides the big proclaim of politics. And it's also something that was more internal, the fact that women themselves should be free, not just to argue for a position in society, but also also for their own ghost to be freed in a way, which is what is going on in the entire novel. And I want to conclude also exactly on this idea of a book haunted by ghosts on different directions. And then I would like to discuss this with Jenny and Anne, because I'm sure they have so much to say. Reading just another little passage, this time from Elsa Morante herself, when they ask her why this book is so resistant to neorealism, to that kind of assessment of an epic of Italian people. And she said something that later on Giorgio Agamben would take up and would write like a philosophical essay from this little excerpt. For everyone, the passage from fantasy to awareness, from youth to maturity, amounts to a tragic and fundamental experience. For me, such an experience was represented and anticipated by the war. That's where, prematurely and with ruinous violence, I encountered maturity. I said all this in my novel, Licensed Sorcery, even though the novel does not talk about the war at all. So thank you so much for your patience, because now there is Jenny McPhee and Anne Goldstein, prominent translator from Italian. They translated so many important books from Primo Levi and the complete works of Primo Levi that was also edited by Anne, to writers from Curzio Malaparte to John Paul II, and this is the case of Jenny. So it's a big spectrum. So you can just imagine what's inside, like Natalia Ginzburg, the Fausto Cialente, and so on and so forth. So please, Anne and Jenny, join me here.
Jenny, maybe. See.
Okay, so thank you so much, Franco, and also Stefano. Thank you so much for hosting this here, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Anne. And I just also wanted to, for me, translation and writing is collaboration. So I also wanted to thank my editor, Edwin Frank, and the copy editor, Georgia Kuhl, and also everybody Nicholas During, who's selling the books upstairs. I mean, it's a big collaboration, and Sarah Kramer, without whom this never would have happened. So big collaboration. So I thought that what I would do first, so that you could really hear Elisa's voice, is read just a passage from the beginning of the book. It's the introduction. The first part of the book is an introduction to the story of my family, and it's really Elisa saying why she's decided to write this book. So it's chapter 2 from the first part, and it's called Saints, Sultans, and Great Captains in My Room. The mysterious Alvaro is announced. The few rooms that make up our apartment all open onto a long corridor, with one exception. The corridor makes a sharp turn at its far end and finishes in an alcove hidden behind a velvet curtain. The alcove contains a pile of luggage, some useless old lamps, and other items destined for the scrap heap. On one side of this storage space, a door opens onto a small bedroom, formerly a maid's room, but done up for me when I arrived, and the maid relegated to the kitchen. My guardian added some decorations to the room, many of which still exist today: the blue and gold wallpaper and a stoop in the shape of a golden dove, wings spread, golden rays emanating from its head, which she herself diligently replenished, as she did her own with holy water. From that time, 15 years ago, to this day, the room has remained mine. Like a barricade, the heap of stuff filling the alcove nearly obstructed the small bedroom door, which in any case only opened halfway. And this door, along with the heavy curtain hanging in front of my little vestibule, muffled, for my delicate ears, the sounds coming from the other rooms. The only window overlooks a courtyard, and is not the large and noisy main courtyard, but a narrow one where almost no one ever goes. The apartment building is 10 stories high, and in this courtyard, enclosed by 4 very tall cement walls, like a kind of open-air tower, the sun never penetrates at any hour of the day or during any season. The base of the tower is strewn with garbage, and a dull grass grows between the paving stones. Other than mine, only a few scattered windows look onto the courtyard. From one of them, you could sometimes hear the plaintive song of a poor country servant as she leaned out to beat a carpet. On Sunday, she hung her little mirror on the window frame so she could see herself while fixing her hair. A greenfinch living in a cage in a sunless apartment was occasionally perched on the sill to get some fresh air, while screeching swallows crisscrossed the top of the almost vertiginous open-air tower. From distant rooms, I could sometimes hear voices blaring from gramophones. The vast majority of my time in this apartment was spent entombed in this small room. Like a contemplative monk, I kept company with my books and myself. I was estranged from all that went on in the nearby rooms. I had no social life or entertainment of any sort, and I was immune to the frivolities indulged in by even the most modest girls. You mustn't, however, conclude that this lonely room was the refuge of a saint. No, rather, it was the refuge of a witch. Today, looking back, the speed with which time passed while I was closed away in this room might indeed have been the work of a witch. 15 whole years fled by with such rapidity that it feels to me like a single day, and not even a day, but an hour, arrested in the middle of a summer afternoon, the dismal white light reflecting off the chalk walls of the courtyard. Now the blue wallpaper inside takes on a somber electric sheen. My only companion in the room is Alvaro, a living creature, yes, but not human. I won't tell you anything more about him, nor who or what he is, holding out, as in a detective story, the mysteries of revelation for the denouement. But since for humans Alvaro's company doesn't count, I am, in a word, alone. Sometimes I hear the song of the greenfinch and the poor country servant's responses, along with the diffuse echoes from the nearby rooms. But these sounds don't count. I am surrounded by silence. Thank you.
Taking off from what Franco said about the unpleasant characters, as a translator, I want to know how it was to live with those unpleasant characters for 5 years, something like that?
5+, yeah. I have a very interesting family myself, so living with unlikable characters is nothing new. But no, it was, I mean, what was really fascinating to me was that here we're always hearing in the newspapers and critics of women writers and, but there are no likable characters. You can't, you're not going to be successful if you don't have a likable character. And here's a whole book with like completely unlikable characters, like
extremely unlikable,
extraordinarily unlikable.
I mean, they just have so many.
But then it becomes so interesting that, in and of itself, that that relentlessness that she has with each of those characters to show this sort of really harsh side of who we are, which I think is part of her sort of vision and mission in this book is, the dark side of humanity.
Just speaking from my own Morante experience of translating the Isola di Arturo, Arturo's Island, which the characters are not, I mean, they're also kind of likable, but not to that degree.
Yeah.
But the suffocatingness of being in the mind of that character really got to me. And I'm just wondering how you would.
Yeah, no, that's something interesting about translating, right? Because with each book, you do sort of become the author. So you live so intimately with each line, each punctuation mark for such a long time. And then this with 800 pages, I mean. So you do become the author. So what I became more was really fascinated and challenged by what Morante was trying to do with these characters and this weird plot and weird story. So.
Maybe we can say just a couple of words. You anticipated the main character, that is Elisa, who is not exactly the main character because she's the daughter of the entire story, 3 generations of her family, where women are much more prominent, of course. But she's now isolated. She finally finds solitude, which is something very interesting because in order to write, you have to find that kind of solitude. There is an essay by Jonathan Franzen and How to Be Alone, but that is important because that's the first step to being able to enter in the mind of other people, if you want to be a narrator and also a translator. But when she finds the solitude, the ghosts from the past are coming back. She's a witch. She's evoking. She's this person that cannot but thinking that if I write about the generation of my family that, that were not nice to me, as we tried to discuss earlier, maybe I'm able to heal. Which, of course, doesn't happen because that's what everybody would expect from the book, but the book goes in totally different directions. And but this idea of someone at the center of the novel that is trying to evoke a past that didn't pass, I think that can be very haunting, especially if you're a translator for a while, for a long period of time.
Yeah, well, also really interesting to me, of course, is there's so many incredible central questions to this book. But one of them is about how to be a writer and a woman in the 20th century, and finding that room of her own. She'd read Virginia Woolf, so she was really, and how do you deal with all the ghosts of the past? How do you deal with actually writing within patriarchy? And how do you, how are you going to take on history? All of history. She takes on all of history, and eventually winds up at La Storia. But basically, she sees us in this never-ending circle of defeat.
Yeah, well, in a funny way, with La Storia, it's much more realistic. She sort of takes a turn after having rejected realism to something a sort of almost hyper-realism, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's also got a lot of unlikable characters, but...
Yeah, it's true. I do see a lot of the beginning of La Storia, though, here.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's sort of as a trajectory. Do you see that? Yeah,
absolutely. But La Storia, which is the most famous novel by Morante, the one that really kind of set her on an international level. Maybe not in the United States, I have to say, but the novel is widely translated worldwide. That's instead the story of a woman during Second World War of Jewish origin, who is not a heroine again. She's not an intellectual. Actually, she's not understanding what's going on around her, and violence happened in the novel on and on. But she has 2 amazing children, which is also something that is at the center of this novel, like being a mother, the relationship, the nexus mother and daughter, which here is very problematic. But in La Storia, and also in, now that I think about it, even in L'Isola di Arturo, Arturo's Island, the whole idea is exactly about the child. Then there is a missing mother. And I mean, of course, on this I can say very little, but I would like you to, comment on the motherhood and how it is displayed and organized within these novels.
Well, it really, you could read all of them as just stories about mothers. I noticed that in Arturo's Island, his mother dies giving birth to him, and he worships her. He has only a picture, and he worships her. But Elisa also worships her mother. I mean, almost the same language, I noticed. She says, my mother was a queen to me. And Arturo says almost the same thing. But then it doesn't go very well. I don't know, maybe we should talk about...
Yeah, I'm thinking...
And actually, then, in fact, that in Menzogne sortilegio, there are layers of generations of mothers.
Yes, yeah, which is all again part of the. She said about la storia. What is it? La storia è uno scandalo che non finisce per 10.000 anni. The history is a scandal that has been going on for 10,000 years. So this idea of the repetition of what you were wonderfully describing as our sort of self-built prisons. What she does through the generations of the women here is just show how the way women are interacting with each other, they're choosing kind of a solitude and a rejection of each other because they're influenced by patriarchy, so that they just keep going in this perpetual oppression, and they are contributing to their own and sort of collaborating in their own oppression, never breaking out by, say, deciding on solidarity. So that message is like extremely strong in this book.
In fact, it was interesting because when the book came out, a lot of Marxist critics complained because the revolutionary characters are not are depicted like some lacking, some driven by passions. They were selfish ultimately. Then there was Giorgi Lukács, great Marxist critic, that said, hey, wait a minute, this is the best Italian novel of the last 100 years. So everybody's like, oh, no, it's actually a great novel. It's an amazing novel. No, actually, we didn't understand when it came out. It was ahead of time. So all those kind of great phrases that save. But what I find interesting is that it's really, it's an amazing fairy tale, written as a fairy tale, but then you realize it's a tale told by Kafka. So this fairy tale quality of the writing, and you mentioned before, is so different, the style from what happened later, from what she wrote later. This fairy tale quality, before I read a couple of lines of one of the many poems, it's a novel with poems, which is something that now is kind of rare, but back then was also a way to address different kind of genre. So you see how experimental that novel was, even like writing in a style that is already ancient, already old, and yet you're talking about the trauma of the war, as she herself said. So yes, there is these personal traumas, and what made me, what I really would like maybe to ask is that you've been living so much with Elsa Morante and her writing, but she's such an elusive author. Can you say so? Actually, this is a question for both, because you both live with such an elusive author. And
yeah, so before I get to the elusive author, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, because you brought up the style. And so as a translator, this was incredibly difficult because she's writing in this Baroque style, but she's also parodying the Baroque style, and at the same time trying to also be extremely modern, if not postmodern, Kafka, in her. So capturing that was really extremely tough because, so when I first agreed to translate this, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And many of my Italian friends were like, oh my God, how can you do that? It's just such a hard book. And would throw it across the room after, because it's not an easy read. So for me, it was actually really tough because I wanted to make sure that she has an American English readership. I don't want everybody throwing it across the room, but I want to be faithful to this sort of weird Baroque style Kafka thing that she's doing. So that was extraordinarily difficult. And, as a translator, you're always kind of listening. You're listening for the voice, always listening to get there. And it was so elusive. So she was so elusive, like, what, where are you? What are you actually doing? Where are you? And what happened was, so, as a translator, you just do it and keep doing it and just keep hoping that it's going to come. And what happened was I finished it actually right after COVID, and there was a paper shortage. And so it sat on a shelf for a year. And then Edwin, who should be here somewhere, he read it and said, okay, we're going to publish. And he started reading, and he said, you need to read this again and need to look at it again. And I did, and it was having that year away, I could hear. And I went back in, and it just, and I mean, I worked like a dog, and so did Luca. He reads everything I do, my husband. And I found her. And so, you never find Elsa Morante. I mean, she's like Elena Ferrante in that she is very elusive and purposefully so. She totally believes that the author is the work. The cult of the author is nothing she would ever, and in fact, it was interesting because Alberto Moravia was like the uber cult of the author, but, she completely rejected that. So much so that, you can barely, you're the wonderful movie, there were almost no pictures of her. It's really hard to find. So yeah, she's amazingly elusive in a really interesting way. That's part of who she is.
Yeah.
Well, I just would say that Elena Ferrante, the actual elusive author, I mean, not the person we don't know who she is, in a way, in her books is not elusive. I mean, there is an author, you feel very strongly that there is an author there. Whereas Morante, you really don't. I mean, partly because, there are these 3 giant novels, basically, and they're written they're all written by somebody else. You feel like there's like a different person is right. I mean, of course there are similarities and similar. I mean, you could feel that they were written by different people.
There is a huge development in Moravia's fiction. All the books are different. There are some recurring themes, but really every book is like a challenge. It's very challenging, but a new challenge also to what she can do to herself first. I feel.
I mean, if you think of Arturo, which I did just mention, I mean, it's written completely from the point of view of a teenage boy, of an adolescent boy. I mean, that's really incredible. And you believe. I mean, you're in the mind of this boy, and you believe it. And it's similarly with Elisa.
Yeah, and then she moves, even though it's Elisa narrating, the story really isn't hers, as you said. It moves from the point of view of the different characters. So it's true. It's the and Ginzburg was a little bit like that too. The I disappears so much in her work.
In fact, we were just talking before this presentation how different is also this kind of narrative from what is most customary today, because all these characters don't play the victim, don't play the I character. They're, again, elusive, which might be part of the magic of reading them today. My next question is we discussed about this book as challenging, as something that, again, it's not just long, but also it takes like something that you have to read it with your body, not just with your mind, because it can change really your perspective on, at least on Italy in that period, I would say, but also on relationship, especially the mother-daughter relationship, which is at the core probably of this book. But why do you think this translation and licensed sorcery is relevant today?
That's a good question. Okay, so it's gotten really nice reviews, okay? But I've been really kind of shocked because, first of all, I didn't think it would get that kind of attention at all. So I've been really sort of thinking about that. Like, why is it, these reviews have been just incredibly thoughtful, but also very enthusiastic and very energized by this book. And so it just really has made me think about the relevance to today, which I thought a lot about while I was translating. But as Ginzburg says, the drumbeat of fascism is on every page. And even though it's never mentioned, the structures, especially the family structure, that mirrors the structures of the public world, are so, they're the thing that keeps fascism possible. And this book is saying that on every page. And so I think it does speak a bit to where we are at the moment. What are the elements of our lives and how we structure our lives that are allowing for this? It's not so. Morante and Ginzburg, they're really not about othering. They don't like the othering. And Malaparte. They really want us to look at who we are and how we are allowing, and especially the middle class for her, how we're allowing our desire to have a piece of that white male privilege is our undoing.
Well, well, I liked the book earlier. Now I really need to reread it. So I have another big question, and then maybe, I don't know, I hope that public will have questions, because there's so much to say still about this book, or if Anna has something else to add. But we mentioned that at the beginning, but this book was translated as House of Liars, something completely different. 200 pages are missing from the early translation. And I read the early translation, and of course, all the parts that are missing look like the most interesting, the most political. They are the parts that are controversial that I kept reading on and on, because I was not sure what was going on, and that is an engrossing reading. That makes the entire book challenging, as we said. So, how about translating a book that's been butchered first, that was like morphed in something different? I'm just curious.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting thing, too, because I think that a lot of the trouble that I had, in a way, was, of course, I always say, if you're a translator or a writer, you have to have an incredible amount of humility and hubris. So here I am, translating this incredible writer, and I want to do her justice. I really want to do it. And she was so devastated, just devastated. She said, her life was ruined when she was so hopeful that this translation would give her this whole new audience in 1952 or whatever, and it was just a devastation. And so I think I was extremely worried about not doing the same thing over again somehow, or so I do think that made me a little bit too faithful to her originally, and I think that year away let me also find my voice in this book. So.
And how about your experience with books that have been already translated?
Oh.
And then,
Well, actually, I was going to say that I'm wondering if there's anything to know about this. But this book, the second novel by Alba de Cespedes, who was writing at the same time, which came out in 1949, I think, in Italy, and then was translated and similarly butchered in the English translation. So I just wonder if there was somebody thought, Americans aren't going to read a book this long, or something. Dalla parte di lei. Yeah.
So yeah, just a plug for Alba de Cespedes here, because if you haven't read Forbidden Notebook, you have to run out and get it right now. I mean, it's so incredible, and which translated by Anne. But the mother-daughter relationship there mirrors the mother-daughter relationships here. Just how how the undermining and the competition and the desire and everything just stops us from really helping ourselves move forward. But it's a really good, it's a great book. I really recommend it.
And in fact, I was also thinking while you were discussing about the Cespedes, Morante, but also Natalia Ginzburg's Family Lexicon that you translated, another remarkable book from last century, a key book to understand not just Italy, but the 20th century as a whole. The relationship between her, Natalia, and her mother is like a larger-than-life character. She's very, very interesting. It's something that is not resolved. So I wonder if these books, the Cespedes, Morante, Ginzburg, are, talking to one another, starting from this nexus that has been very little analyzed, especially in literary history, but it is at the center of their narratives.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is kind of interesting when you start reading these women who are writing basically at the same time. In Italy, and finding these mirrors, connections. Here they all are, dealing with their mothers.
Well, again, I mean, now we call it the domestic novel or whatever, but they were really looking at the family and how the domestic, the structure of the family and what we've made of the family, and how that can be so incredibly destructive.
And also,
instead
again,
of romanticizing the family, which is what we do.
No,
Yes, sorry.
In relation to fascism, I'm just repeating
yes,
you. I'm just echoing you.
Yes, in relation to fascism, exactly.
And I think they all felt a kind of disappointment in what happened after the war, and that's also in their writing.
Yeah, I mean, neorealism. I love neorealism, but it's not real. I mean, she was right. It was a way of excusing what happened, in a way of making heroes out of the Italians, which is lovely, but not true, as Morante would say.
I just finished with a little episode from my classes when I teach this period, because I've been working a lot on this, and the students ask me, but can we read something like about female heroes of the resistance? I mean, there is a novel, L'Agnese va a morire, but it's so awful, it's so boring. Of course, there is the woman sacrificing herself for her son, for her father, brother. So here you don't have the idea of the woman who has to sacrifice herself. You have something else. The characters here, Anna, who was at the center of the entire novel, her egotism is like until the very last second, and it is disturbing. And her daughter cannot understand it because everything she's loved in her life. That's her model, but it's not a positive model. So I think this relationship is challenging, but it's really worth. Despite we said it's difficult, it's long, but this is a novel that really it raises a bar and makes a big difference in narrative at the time.
What I also really love about it is it includes the reader. You are part of it. Like, you're the writer along with, and she's asking you on every page to engage. And I love that. It's not storytelling to just tell a story. It's narrative that's so inclusive.
Wow. Clap your hands. Now, this is very important because, as Stefano said earlier, translation is key, not just for cultural relationships, but also to understand what's behind, what's behind another literature. Primo Levi was saying that only the translator really reads a book, because it's like a bodily relationship. And with this, again, we have two outstanding translators here, Jenny, but also Anne. And I would like to open the discussion. And Jumpa, oh, that's true. So, please.
Hi. I have a double question. One, the figure of Moravia was invoked, and he's of course on the scene. And as you mentioned, he's kind of this meteoric figure who becomes very famous early. And as I was beginning to read Morante's book, I was thinking of The Indifferenti, which I think came out in 34? 39, was it? Okay. So, and there's something of the, because it also has the same thing of, there's a sense of a corruption of society, but fascism is not mentioned. It's kind of there in the background, but of course it's very male and she's female. But I'm wondering whether you thought about how these two writers were very important to one another. And so I'm wondering how that factored into her artistic production, particularly in the years in which they were together. And then the second question is whether she revised the book substantially after returning to get the manuscript she'd left in Rome and doesn't get until 44. So those are
yours.
Well, as I said earlier, they were writing two important books, basically in the same little apartment, and the two books speak to one another. Though at that time, La Romana, Woman from Rome, was a stunning success, and also was more translatable, it was more accessible, and therefore it was even closer to what we think of neorealism. A character who comes from the lower class, whereas Menzogne Sortilegio, Lies and Sorcery, has a character who's actually basically is a decayed noble woman, or only she thinks she's a noble woman still. The entire people around her knows the reality, which is part of the meaning of the title. So Morante and Moravia, I mean, there's a library about their relationship because they were one of the most famous and also they were one of the most famous couples in Rome of that time. Both of them were flamboyant in their own way. They were egotistical in their own way. And dinners with them were awful, a lot of people said. Only Pasolini was able to have a dinner with them because at a certain point they were starting fighting. And then on and on they were making peace until the moment where peace was not negotiable anymore. And but as a matter of fact, they were close until the very end, which is something interesting. Elsa Morante, later on in her life, she became a sort of guru for a lot of writers in Italy, but also she preferred a new kind of solitude, a solitude full of cats. I mean, we didn't say that, but there is some cats in this novel, and the cats are always there in Elsa Morante's fiction. And so their relationship is particular, and I would say it is, let's put it this way, until very recently, everybody was talking about Moravia and Moravia's wife, Morante. Now we are saying Morante and Morante's husband, Moravia.
Yeah, it killed her because on the translation, the first thing it says is Elsa Morante, wife of Alberto Morante. No, but the other thing I was thinking about that question a little bit is how the figure of Eduardo and the whole idea of privilege, I think, is very attached to Moravia, because she really saw him as the sort of figure of the establishment and the embodiment of male privilege. So I think that figures into as you read on, you'll see how Eduardo starts to, and I think that's maybe a Moravia connection there. I don't know.
That's definitely a fascinating read. I think you have another question.
When did you revise it after she?
Un secondo.
When did you revise it after returning to Rome and we recovered the manuscript in 44?
Okay. The question is basically, she recovered the manuscript after the war was over, and how the manuscript changed, basically. Okay. There have been so many different layers. I saw the manuscripts, and it's like an encyclopedia. There's a lot of stories, drawings, again, many cats in the pages, and there have been a lot of work that's been done on the philological changes. But still, I would say that the novel took shape much more after the war, in the moment again of this frenzy that Rome was after the Second World War, in which she found her own voice, and she was able to finish it. There is an interview for Mercurio, the journal run by Alba de Céspedes, The interview was like, these are the most prominent writers in Rome today. And so how did you spend the last year? And she was like, I was in my room writing, and that's it. But now the novel is ready. So basically, she kind of find that solitude that you described earlier. And that's where the novel really found its own voice.
So the question I wanted to ask is, Jenny,
Yeah.
this may be an unfair question, but all writing, all translating is a nature of profound solitude and intimacy. And I wanted to know if you could say anything about your own psyche being in conversation with hers. In other words, a separate, let's go away from fascism and the world of the patriarchy and talk about you and she in conversation as women.
Yeah, so, I mean, then yes, I mean, that definitely happens, and it's why I translate. Because I have so much to learn from, and I've been very privileged to be able to translate these women, but they have so much to teach me, and for sure I'm in very intimate dialogue with them. It's not lonely, you know, they're there speaking to me, and I mean, it sounds airy-fairy and ghostly, but it is spiritual. I mean, there's no question about it. It's definitely, and yeah, they give me so much. I mean, Natalia Ginzburg is like my spirit guide. I mean, she's with me every day. I mean, so yeah, it's a nice question. It's deep.
You've spoken a bit about authors of the mid-century during this period being in conversation with each other as they publish these books. I wonder if the two of you have thoughts about translators of these authors being in conversation with each other, whether these authors echoed each other in language or inverted each other's language in ways that you note and try to honor in your translations of these contemporaneous works.
I thought your question was different but it's a really good question because it's sort of no coincidence that in this, as translators, we're all in conversation with each other all the time around that language of those women that we translate. So it's more to the other question. But in terms of the actual, I mean, I just discover all the time. I always read everything Anne translates because you know, there's so much is revealed to me about Anne, but about about the authors that she's translating that do speak to who I'm translating, and it is just a big conversation. Even though you said that it was lonely, it's like a huge, fabulous conversation that happens. Intimate, yeah.
But we had, I mean, the ultimate, I guess, version of this is that we did translate a book together. And so then we were having both conversation with the author and conversation with each other, literally, which was wonderful. I mean, really a great,
That was
Ortese,
Anna Maria Ortese, Neapolitan Chronicles, who's also in the conversation in a big, different way.
Yes, in a different way, but.
Just a question regarding the 200 missing pages. I'm fascinated by the whole story, and I was wondering, and you mentioned another book that had cuts throughout it, and I was wondering how common that practice was to chop hundreds or dozens of pages from an original book, because we are very familiar with the kind of operation in cinema. So, for example, we know that The Leopard, the original version, is 3 hours, and the American distributor said, no way, it's going to be 2 hours. And Visconti didn't want to have anything to do with those cuts and had Burt Lancaster take care of that. So in cinema, you understand it's part of the market, the box office, the producer and the distributor having a big voice. But I was not aware of the same dynamics also in the literary world. And I was wondering whether it's a thing only in the US, if you're aware of other practices of chopping books in the process of translating them. And it says a lot about the consideration that the cultural elite production had of the American public. In the sense they cannot afford to have a film of 3 hours or a book of 800 pages. Where is that? The desire to keep this audience constantly in a condition of childhood, basically. And if you have any thought about that, because I cannot stop thinking about those 2 missing 100 pages. Thank you so much.
Do you want to respond? Or no? No? Or
if I want to say something, well, I had this conversation, exactly this conversation with my students this week after they came to Bar College, and last weekend we had a fantastic conversation also with Mark Polizzotti, was discussing how it is to translate from French. And the students were appalled by that because they are American students, so they felt that, they are betraying our trust. And I was like, that's just the beginning of a long story. But that's, but also I have to say that while I was working on my research, a lot of the books of that period, my research on the late 40s, the transition from fascism to democracy. So this book was, this book and Malaparte's book are the most striking example because they had entire chapters chopped. But other books that were prominent at the time, because Italian literature had together with neorealism, had a stunning success worldwide in the late 40s. A lot of the passages that were more problematic, especially the political passages or the passages that dealt with religion, were chipped away, or even one word was missing. It was often a book like Giuseppe Berto, The Sky is Red, that very few people remember today, but back then was discussed by Hemingway as the best Italian novel of the decade. And I think it's really worth reading because Berto was for 2 years in Texas, in Hereford, in the concentration camp as an Italian POW. So basically, the entire book and the last pages are cut. The pages when you find the meaning of the entire story are cut. So what did Hemingway read?
It's a very long conversation, but the history of translation in this country è uno scandalo. A scandal.
sure. So first of all, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And Jenny, you have accomplished an epic feat, and this is an epic translation. And so my first question, I have 2 questions, but my first question is just very selfish because I'm also now trying to handle an epic work, Ovid's Metamorphoses. And so the first question is really about sort of how did you pace yourself when you're dealing with a work so enormous? And because one of the things I've found now that we have reached the end of a first draft is an enormous disparity between the initial piece of the book and sort of how we end up 12,000 lines of Latin hexameter later, and we sort of we learn by doing, and we move into Ovid's voice by doing. And so I wonder if you could just say a little bit about your process and I think, did you forget things? I mean, how can you hold all of it in, right? You can't, even as a reader, not even as a translator. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that. And then the other thing is just to work on or build on this idea of the language itself. So, I mean, Morante's language, I remember when I first moved to Rome, and I met at a dinner party, I met the great poet Patrizia Cavalli, and she said, "Oh, you want to learn Italian? Well, just read Elsa Morante, punto, that's it." And because there was something about, she said, her language, you read her, and you learn the best Italian that there ever was and ever will be. And it is true that, I mean, her language, you don't see that language anymore. We don't have that Italian anymore. And so, of course, your task as a translator is to create Elsa Morante for 2023, American readership. But and this is the sort of irritating question. So what are the frustrations you have about that process of, because you don't want it to sound the way she wrote it in her moment with her language, which literally does not exist anymore. And I think that's what Patrizia was telling me, that don't read books that are coming out today. Go read that. Go read Elsa Morante. Go read. And she mentioned this book, and for just even the word Menzogne, which we don't have in English, really. We don't have the richness of that term. So anyway, anything you would like to say?
Well,
Thank you.
no, just on that question, I did have a panic a little while ago, and I thought, oh my God, did I make it too readable? I had that panic. And so, yeah, I mean, that's part of being a translator is, bringing it to an audience. But I think there is a little bit there that's lost in the translation to recapture that, In terms of process, it's just, again, like doing it every day, but listening, and you as you go on, you get the lexicon, and you can't be precise. Like, it's not going to be, okay, I translated this word here on page 1, and it's got to be the same on page 800. And then it's just a matter of listening, and then you
Did
hear
you read it out loud when you were
always
translating?
I always read everything out loud. And then ultimately, but it's really about trusting yourself and your voice in there. And then you get it.
Thank you.
Hi, just a note on the on translation practices. It was standard to edit translations, and to not just for Bowdlerization reasons, for political or sexual reasons. For example, we did a new translation of Moravia's Agostino, which restored the sexual innuendo that had been taken out when it had been first been translated, but also structurally. I mean, Milan Kundera became obsessed with how his work was translated after discovering that the editors had deliberately reversed an order of chapters in the joke. And it's not limited to the United States. I remember talking a few years ago to a German editor, a very serious editor of a very good house, very literary house, who for years was one of the chief translators from Spanish, and the Germans cut something like 40 pages out of Cortázar's Hopscotch. So it's not limited to our own country.
Oh, yeah. You do.
I have a perhaps dangerous question. Most of us who grew up going to college, reading translation, read translations by men. Now there are a great many translations, including recently, I think, the Odyssey or the Iliad, and apparently someone's translating Ovid as well. I don't know. I've heard rumors of that. But at any rate, what is the distinction or difference, if any, between women and men translating?
Opportunity.
Simple as that.
Pretty much. I mean, it's actually a really interesting question. This is long, and I've thought about it a lot. I'll try and keep it short. But yeah, in thinking about, it occurred to me the other day that when you're translating, and there's all this gender stuff, and it all ties in a little bit to why Ginzburg and Morante refused to ever be called feminists. So I've thought about this a lot, and I have a lot to say about it. But just in terms of translation, I did, and I'm an avid feminist, and I do identify as a woman. But when I'm translating, that all goes away. I do not, gender is gone when I'm there, when I'm, every day doing it, whatever. And I bring all my gender, politics, my upbringing, everything to my translations, absolutely, and that's all in there. But in essence, you're somewhere else. You're in between language, you're in no gender, no nothing, no, it's just somewhere else where that doesn't count.
Jenny, I would like to ask you something which is sort of very easy and simple. I think maybe the answer won't be, I don't know, but I'm very curious about the cover of the book, whether you had any saying in sort of working on that, because, the translation begins with, having the book in our hands. And of course, there's already something about the novel in the cover. And so what's the process there, and what do you sort of make out of this particular choice?
So Edwin chose it, but I loved it. So it's Paula Rigo, and she's such an interesting artist and speaks to ghosts and speaks to spirituality and women, and so I completely love it as the cover. And it was the first one you showed me, I think. I mean, it was just really, but covers are really interesting. In that documentary, the cover of La Storia with the dead child and how they have switched it to so you're right. I mean, covers are extremely important. But yeah, I love this cover. Yeah.
Elsa Morante chose the cover for the first edition of La Storia.
Exactly, yeah. Yes.
But she also she did a subvention to keep it cheap.
Yes, yes. And so it's, again, another scandalo that they put a cute child sitting on rubble, neo-realist, on the cover of La Storia. Just wrong. Anyway, yes.
And the first edition of Menzogne sortilegio had Chagall on the cover. Yeah. Which is also interesting. That I don't know if she picked the cover, but for that time it was meaningful.
Can I just share something about the cover?
Yes.
So the figure in the upper panel on the right, there are two male figures, monks. This looks like, okay, so the one on the far right is the Portuguese poet Alberto de la Cerda, and I studied with him. He was my professor and he became my friend. And then he took me to the National Gallery in London to lunch, where it is on the wall. And he said, does it remind you of anybody? And of course it was him, and he was so proud because Paula Rego was his friend. So it was I loved seeing this cover. It was so beautiful to find him again.
Yeah. What a fabulous story. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for supporting translation.